$25.6 million deepfake heist proved the attack is real. This episode is about something worse for executives: liability with no theft, because the U.S. Treasury treats undocumented AI governance as a governance and risk exposure that can sit inside corporate fraud examinations. On March 26, 2024, Treasury's Office of Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure Protection, the sector risk management agency for all of U.S. financial services, they published a report that inverted a belief most executives in this room hold right now. OCCIP-2024-03-26. That belief, deploying advanced AI, signals regulatory sophistication. It reduces your enforcement risk. It shows you're ahead of the curve. Treasury's conclusion was the opposite, and by January 2026, the regulatory signal had converged. The experimental window for AI governance was effectively treated as closed. The question isn't whether your AI works. It's whether you can prove how you govern it, and most organizations cannot. FinScan-2026-01-11. My name is ScamBeast. I analyze corporate fraud patterns for finance and technology professionals. What follows is sourced entirely from federal regulatory documentation. No opinion, no speculation, pattern recognition only. To understand why this matters, you need to understand a four-step regulatory ratchet that has been tightening since January 2023. Step 1. NIST published its AI Risk Management Framework. 4 core governance functions: govern, map, measure, manage. This was positioned as the reference architecture for AI risk management. Here's the part most teams miss. This isn't theory, it's what gets audited. Step 2. 8 months later, Executive Order 14110 directed federal agencies to align AI safety and governance with NIST standards, including work with regulated sectors. This is where the ratchet turns from guidance into expectation. Step 3. On March 26, 2024, U.S. Treasury's Office of Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure Protection issued an AI-specific cybersecurity and fraud report for the financial services sector, in alignment with Executive Order 14110. Treasury wasn't advising. Treasury was executing its sector risk management agency mandate, supervisory weight, not advisory weight. OCCIP 2024-03-26. And here is where the belief breaks. OCCIP Redefining Fraud. Treasury states that AI is, quote, redefining cybersecurity and fraud in the financial services sector, and stresses that emerging technology increases expectations for resilience and fraud prevention, not decreases, increases. Step 4, and the one that closes the ratchet, a January 2026 financial crime regulatory roundup, captured what practitioners were already seeing. FinScan-2026-01-11. Quote, AI adoption raises the compliance bar, not the shield. 4 steps, 3 years, 1 direction. The ratchet doesn't reverse, and most organizations deployed AI during the tightening cycle, without building the governance infrastructure underneath it. OCCIP capability gap. Treasury documented a growing capability gap between large institutions that built in-house AI governance and smaller firms, depending entirely on vendor tools, with no governance infrastructure underneath. This pattern keeps showing up. Capability gaps become documentation gaps. So what did Treasury actually require? And why does it create corporate fraud examination exposure, not protection, for organizations that deployed AI without documenting how they govern it? That is the anatomy of this episode. Let me show you exactly what Treasury required, and then show you the gap between what they required and what most organizations actually have. Because the gap isn't technical, it's documentary. Treasury's report recommends that the NIST AI risk management framework be expanded and tailored to include more applicable content on AI governance for financial services, signaling NIST AI RMF as the intended governance architecture for the sector. Gap 1. This is where governance breaks down. OCCIP explainability, Treasury's framework. Documents that explainability gaps in complex models leave institutions relying on AI decisions without the compensating governance, testing, and auditing practices the framework tests for. If you deployed AI fraud detection, compliance monitoring, or transaction screening, and you cannot explain why the model produces its outputs, the examination surface includes precisely that gap. That is where governance exposure that can be tested in corporate fraud examinations begins, not in a fraudulent act. In a documentation failure, your AI flags a transaction as fraudulent. You act on it. An examiner asks, "Show me your explainability documentation for that decision." You cannot produce it. That isn't a model performance problem. That is a governance gap. And Treasury has already named it. Gap 2. OCCIP nutrition label. Treasury recommends developing standardized, nutrition labels for vendor AI systems, including data provenance and use. Why? Because most financial institutions purchased AI fraud tools from third-party vendors and accepted the vendor's assurance that the system works, without requesting documentation of how the model was trained, what data it uses, or how its outputs can be audited. 3 gaps. Anyone creates examination exposure. Most organizations have all 3. This one is invisible until the examiner asks. Gap 3 is the most dangerous because it is the most invisible. An organization can have sophisticated AI governance and practice and still fail an examination because it cannot produce documentation proving the governance exists. In regulatory terms, undocumented governance and non-existent governance produce the same examination result. Scam Beast viewers will recognize this structure. In Episode 11, we showed how ADM's segment fraud persisted not because controls didn't exist, but because controls' existence did not equal controls' effectiveness. Treasury is making the identical argument about AI. The NIST framework exists. EO14110 exists. Your internal AI policies may exist. Without documentation, testing, and accountability at every layer, they do not constitute governance. Episode 8 established the Cubiant gatekeeper principle. Not stopping a fraud after learning of it creates liability equal to creating it. The AI governance version is this. Not documenting AI governance after Treasury told you to is not a passive failure. It is an active exposure. The Treasury report is your knowledge event. This is what Treasury means when it says AI is redefining fraud risk. OCCIP redefining fraud. The emerging fraud risk category isn't someone hacking your AI. It is the gap between what you tell examiners your AI governance achieves and what you can prove. Examiner arrives tomorrow. They do not ask whether your AI fraud detection system works. They ask, "Show me your AI risk map. Show me your model validation documentation. Show me your board-level oversight protocol." What do you hand them? Most organizations hand them nothing, and Treasury has already told you what that means. OCCIP capability gap. Treasury highlights a growing capability gap between large institutions and smaller firms, flagging governance and risk asymmetry. Smaller firms relying entirely on vendor AI face this exposure without the infrastructure to close it quickly. 3 gaps, 1 ratchet tightening since 2023, and examiners building the capacity to audit all of it right now. Now, here's how the examination behaves. Here is what most executives get wrong about AI. Governance examinations. They're not testing whether the AI caught fraud. They're testing whether you can prove governance. The false assumption is that AI governance is a technology audit. It is not. It is a documentation audit. The examiner is not a data scientist. They are an accountability analyst. Your AI's performance metrics don't carry weight if you cannot produce the documentation proving the governance underneath it. This is where executive deception enters the frame, not as malicious intent, but as a regulatory category. When executives certify AI risk management capabilities in board presentations, regulatory filings, or audit responses, they cannot substantiate with documentation. The gap between certification and reality is the exposure. Treasury has named the gap. Regulators are now building the audit capacity to measure it. I'm going to give you the 3 questions first, because they repeat. Question 1. Provide your AI risk inventory. Every AI system, its function, its data sources, its output types, and the named individual accountable for its governance. Question 2. Provide your model validation documentation. Who validated, when, what methodology, what failure modes were identified, what compensating controls exist. Question 3. Provide your board-level oversight protocol, which governance body holds AI risk accountability, with what frequency, under what escalation standard. If the answer to any of these is, we don't have that in a formal document, you have handed the examiner a roadmap to the exact governance gap Treasury already told you to close. An empty field in a governance examination is not a documentation problem. It is an examination exposure event. Treasury's own report found that compliance teams supervising AI lacked the role-specific training to conduct meaningful oversight. Recursive exposure. The people responsible for documenting AI governance don't know what adequate documentation looks like. The oversight layer itself is deficient. A vendor's SOC2 report, ISO certification, or product brochure is not your AI governance documentation. It documents the vendor's practices. It says nothing about how your organization governs that AI in your specific operational context. OCCIP nutrition label. Treasury's nutrition label recommendation exists precisely because this gap is systemic. For firms relying on vendor AI without governance documentation, there is a compounding exposure. The model may have been trained on data that does not reflect your organization's specific risk profile, and you have no document proving you evaluated that question. Treasury calls this the fraud data divide. This is the anatomy of governance and enforcement exposure in corporate fraud examinations that has no perpetrator, no victim, and no incident, only a documentation gap between what was claimed and what can be proven. In the resolution, I will show you what a defensible AI governance posture actually looks like. 3 documents derived directly from Treasury's own language, not recommendations, documentation standards. Finskin's January 2026 roundup describes this as a compliance perimeter expansion. AI doesn't simplify compliance. It adds a layer that examiners expect to see governed, documented, and overseen, or it becomes the exposure itself. The mental model shift. AI governance is not a technology problem. It is a documentation problem, and documentation problems have a specific, predictable examination signature, and this is why it matches the scam beast pattern. Now let's look at the pattern, because scam beast viewers know that individual cases are symptoms. The pattern is the diagnosis. The corporate fraud examination pattern here is the same documented across 12 episodes. Governance architecture that exists on paper, but fails operationally. Episode 11, ADM segment fraud, survived multiple quarters, not because controls didn't exist, but because controls' existence did not equal controls' effectiveness. Treasury is making the identical argument about AI. The NIST framework exists. internal AI policies may exist. Without documentation, testing, and accountability at every layer, they do not constitute governance. Episode 12. Audit committees became information filters instead of escalation conduits. The AI governance parallel, board-level AI oversight that exists as a mandate, but receives no substantive documentation from management, performs the same filtering function. The warning is absorbed, it never escalates. The pattern across episodes 8, 11, 12, and 13 is identical. Governance architecture was present, fraud was absent, but documentation of how governance operated was missing, and that documentation gap created the examination exposure inside corporate fraud reviews. 4 episodes. 4 governance layers. 1 pattern. Documentation failure as the examination exposure mechanism. January 2026. Regulatory signals indicate that examiners are building AI governance audit capacity. The documentation gap that exists today is already an active audit surface. This is not a future risk. OCCIP capability gap. Large institutions with in-house AI governance teams have a structural advantage. Smaller firms, relying entirely on vendor AI, have the exposure without the capability to close it quickly. Treasury highlights this asymmetry explicitly. The most dangerous version of this exposure, organizations that deployed AI specifically to strengthen fraud controls and created governance examination exposure in the process by failing to document how those controls were governed. The pattern is clear. The question is whether you are in the documentation gap, or you have already closed it. A defensible AI governance posture under the regime Treasury established is not complicated. It is specific. 3 documents. 3 accountability assignments. This is not a recommendation. This is what the posture is examined as. Document 1. The AI risk inventory. The examination tests for coverage of every AI system your organization uses. System name, function, data sources, output type, decision authority, and the named individual accountable for its governance. If this document does not exist, examination exposure is immediate. Document 2. The model validation file. OCCIP explainability for each AI system. Who validated it, when, what methodology was used, what failure modes were identified, and what compensating controls exist for each failure mode. This is the direct operational response to Treasury's explainability gap warning. Organizations without this file present undocumented governance and enforcement exposure in corporate fraud examinations for every AI-assisted decision they cannot explain. Document 3. The Board Oversight Protocol. The examination tests for which governance body holds AI risk accountability, with what frequency it receives AI risk reporting, under what escalation standard material changes are reported, and who at the executive level signs off on AI risk assessments. 3 documents. They map directly to NIST RMF. Govern, map, measure, manage. The framework is not abstract. It has a specific document architecture. For vendor AI systems, the examination surface includes a governance addendum. Documentation of what OCCIP nutrition label information was requested from the vendor, what was provided, and what compensating governance was implemented for the gaps. Treasury's human capital gap has an operational resolution. The report flags the absence of role-specific AI training for the compliance officer, supervising AI governance as an oversight deficiency, and documentation of that training becomes part of the governance record. Episode 8 established, liability attaches when you know and don't act. The Treasury report is your knowledge event. January 2026 signals the documentation window is closing. The architecture exists. The question is whether you build it before the examination arrives. The anatomy of governance and enforcement exposure in corporate fraud examinations. Not a bad actor, not a breach, not a theft. A documentation gap between what your organization certified about its AI governance and what it can prove when an examiner asks. Now I'll close the open loop from the start. The question was, can you prove how you govern your AI? The answer is now a document architecture question, not a technology question. 3 documents, 3 accountability assignments. That is what prove it means in a Treasury-aligned examination. The governance exposure pattern here is not about intent. It is about the gap between what was certified and what can be documented. Organizations that close that gap are not just compliant. They are the institutional standard that peers will be measured against. Across 13 episodes, the pattern has been consistent. Governance architecture that exists without documentation creates examination exposure as reliably as governance architecture that doesn't exist at all. This episode adds the AI governance layer to that canon. Full sources and documentation are in the description. Follow ScamBeast if you work in finance, tech, or leadership. I analyze corporate fraud patterns, so you don't have to.